All right. Well, great to see everyone today. Before we dive in with Babylonian exile, I wanted to see if there are any questions that folks might have up front.
Of course. So the book talked about, kind of the literary irony of Zedekiah being captured on the banks of the River Jordan, trying to cross over to escape. And when you read that part in the source material, that's a really gruesome ending. But I was thinking, there's also some symmetry, because the Old Testament sometimes says Babylonians, but sometimes says Chaldeans.
Chaldeans, yeah.
And I know it's not the very same Chaldeans as Abrahamic times, but I found some symmetry in the children of Israel being taken back to the home of the Chaldeans.
There is something about that return, yes. And part of the complication of all this, and we'll have that issue with the Persian Empire and things, is you've got such overlap with groups. I mean, the Persians are made up of Persians and Parthians and Medes and the Elamites. Then they conquer the Babylonians. On and all. Greeks, they conquer into India. So they've got all these groups. So they're part of the Persian Empire. But then, how do you handle the Parthians? I mean, after the Persian Empire collapses, the Parthian Empire, which is kind of Persian, will be in that area. But so it does get a little complicated there, the Chaldeans and the Babylonians and all that. But no, I think there is some interesting symmetry. You do get that sense of return. Abraham did come from there. And, for that matter, we'll talk about it, I think, more next time. I think it's next time. I did both PowerPoints, so they're kind of together. But we'll talk about the Jewish community in Babylon is huge. And is important all the way through the Middle Ages and really lasted into the 20th century. I think they're down to 4 now, but they were up in the 150,000 in mid 20th century, and that really was the center of Judaism after Jerusalem was destroyed. So we'll talk about that at some point. But there is some symmetry of coming back to Abraham's homeland, certainly. Good thought. Other things. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Get the PowerPoint up. All right, every time it's a little bit different here. Okay. One more correction. There we go. All right. Well, we are at the time of the fall of Jerusalem here, and just a reminder where we are on our timeline. If the timeline comes up, come on. Computer's slow this morning. There we go. So we are, at the end of things. Last time we talked about kind of this time, Manasseh and Josiah. Really, we're doing the aftermath of Josiah into the Babylonian exile this time. Especially, Josiah's sons and grandsons down here are still on the throne. Then the temple gets destroyed, and we get Babylonian exile in a couple of ways. We'll talk more about that. Last time I think it was last time we talked about these various empires, and as things go, as timelines go, the Babylonian Empire is really rather short in its control of the Middle East, of the Levant, the Near East, I guess, Near East and Middle East, but because of the fact they do conquer Jerusalem, because of the fact that they do destroy the temple and they do take the Jews into exile in Babylon, there is a larger importance. There's an outsized importance to the Babylonians compared to a lot of these other empires. Their time is not as long, but because they do such influential things that really shift the history so dramatically, they're more important than you might guess just from longevity. So far so good. So we've seen this map before. Assyria, just to keep ourselves oriented, Assyria is a pretty big empire. It goes into what was Persia, the Persian Empire later. It goes down to Egypt later. The Babylonian Empire is not going to be as big. I tried to match up the same scale and same angle. That's why the map is tilted. there a little bit. And a reminder, this map, my favorite map, is in French, unfortunately, for the Babylonians. But the Babylonian Empire is smaller than the Assyrian Empire. And Babylon was part of the Assyrian Empire. They rebelled successfully eventually and then took over. You might notice, though, they did not take over as far up to the northeast as the heart of Assyria. They took some Assyrian territory, like Assur, which was an important Assyrian city. Here's Assur here, but they don't take Nineveh, which is up in here. They leave Assyria as kind of a remnant outside the borders of the empire in some ways there. But they certainly do take Jerusalem and wipe it off the map. But we looked at this timeline last time, especially with the Assyrians in mind. But in the 630s, they start to weaken. Josiah is killed when Egypt is coming to assist Assyria against Babylon. Egypt is not successful. Josiah is not successful. Assyria is not successful. Only Babylon comes out on top. And a few years later, Babylon is on top, and they are the top dog from 605 until the Persians roll in about 65 years later in the area. And we've looked at this quote before, but I think this is a good reminder here. At this point, the Davidic monarchy gets caught up in these larger struggles between dying Assyria, resurgent Egypt, rising Babylon, and Judah playing geopolitics with the big boys comes out the loser. And when King Josiah dies in 609, the Davidic dynasty is on its way out, and just a couple decades later will be gone. And we'll talk more about that in just a second here. So Josiah is killed 609 BC. 608, the Egyptians replace Josiah's son with a brother who they think will be more malleable and more loyal as a vassal. So Jehoiakim is on the throne in 608. And he is loyal for a while, but then he switches sides. Instead of being an Egyptian vassal, he becomes a Babylonian vassal. And then he switches sides again and decides to rebel against Babylon. So he's again playing geopolitics with the big boys, and it doesn't come out well for him any more than it came out for his father. So Jehoiakim is dead, and Jehoiakim is replaced by his son with the horribly confusing name of Jehoiakim. So you have Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim. You may as well number them like James Paul V and James Paul VI, because this is so close, it's just darn confusing. But son Jehoiakim's on the throne when the Babylonians roll into Jerusalem the first time. And they take him off into exile. They take off some intelligentsia and some rich folks from Jerusalem, including the prophet Ezekiel. He's carried off in this first wave of 597 exile. And the Babylonians put Jehoiakim's uncle, Jehoiakim's brother, on the throne. Zedekiah goes on the throne, thinking he'll be a loyal vassal. And playing these political games, he is for a while, but then he rebels in 590, 7 years later. And so Babylon gets their act together, rolls in, and besieges Jerusalem again. And this time they decide they're going to make an example of it and not going to leave it as a threat anymore. So they wipe out the walls. If your city is not walled, it is defenseless. They also wipe out the temple. They wipe out the king's palace. And this is just if you're going to take out a country, this is the recipe for taking out a country. You take out their king, you take out the king's palace, you take out the walls of the capital, you take out the central temple of the religion. And so horrible, horrible event in the history of the Jewish people. The Babylonians plunder the treasure of the temple. They take even more of the intelligentsia and the Jerusalem population into exile in Babylon. They kind of leave the peasant class, and they leave some folks kind of out in the hinterland, but they kind of strip off the professional class. That's a little anachronistic, but they strip off the top layers of Jewish society, take them off into exile. Interestingly, the prophet Jeremiah doesn't get taken away, so he's apparently not that important as far as the Babylonians are concerned. He eventually goes with a group of exiles into Egypt, self-imposed exile. And just to make things worse, Zedekiah, the king, the Babylonians try to make an example of him and his royal line. In fact, they end his royal line. He has to watch his sons get executed in front of his eyes. Then the Babylonians blind him. So that's the last thing he sees is his dead sons and his dynasty done. So the Assyrians are brutal, but the Babylonians can play brutal games as well. That's a pretty brutal way to end a rebellious country. And that's what happens with the Jews. We're not quite really the Jews yet, but we're almost on the cusp of where we can really start calling the Hebrew people the Jews. But anyway, this is a tough ending here with Babylon rolling in and just wiping Jerusalem, wiping the slate clean, turning the Etch-a-Sketch over and erasing them basically. And seemingly that's it for the Davidic line. But then there's just this little tiny hint of hope. We remember his son Jehoiakim got hauled off in 597. Well, the last 4 verses of 2 Kings, which means the last 4 verses of the Deuteronomistic history, ends with a little epilogue about Jehoiakim. Zedekiah dies in captivity, but King Jehoiakim, in the year 560, is released from his captivity. He's allowed to not be in jail anymore, whatever kind of arrest they had him under in Babylon. In fact, the Babylonian king at that point, this would be a good fantasy evil king name, Evil Merodach. Evil not meaning bad, just that's the way it transliterates. Evil Merodach of Babylon releases him out of his imprisonment, and he lets him hang out at the king's palace. He gives him an allowance. He lets him dine in the royal court. And as long as he lives, he's kind of a member of the greater Babylonian entourage of the court king. So just a little tiny glimmer of hope here. The prophet Isaiah earlier talks about shoots coming out of the stump of Jesse. There's just hope for a little bit of a shoot coming out of the Davidic line here. So just a tiny note of hope at the end of the destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of the Jewish people as most peoples were understood at that time, destruction of their temple, and just this little glimmer of hope that the last king, the last living king, is allowed to be out and about again. But when he dies, the Davidic monarchy is gone as far as a monarchy. The Jews actually trace Davidic descendants, but never again will there be a Jewish king in the same way of David's line. Interestingly, also, the descendants will later include a number of influential rabbis. Now, rabbis are very different from priests. Priests have to be of the tribe of Levi. David's of the tribe of Judah. But it's interesting that a lot of David's descendants become influential teachers in Israel and in Judaism, which is kind of a fascinating way. We can't be kings anymore, but we can teach and wield our influence that way. We can't be priests because we're not of the Levitical tribe, but we'll wield influence not on the throne, not through the temple, but through teaching. And so we've got people like Hillel, who is just one of the Jewish giants of all time. He's like the St. Augustine of Judaism, just so influential, maybe even almost St. Paul, just hugely important in the way that Judaism will be constituted later on. Gamaliel, another famous Jewish rabbi who's mentioned in the book of Acts, also is one of Paul's teachers, mentioned explicitly. He is of David's line. Later on in the Middle Ages, they're still tracing it, and they still trace to this day. Rashi, the great French rabbi, who kind of, and Maimonides, the great Spanish rabbi. And these are the guys that kind of pull Judaism away from Babylon as a center and bring it into Europe, at least if you live in Europe. And so hugely influential. So David's line does continue, but it ain't going to be sitting with a rear end on a throne anymore. They're going to have to exercise influence in other ways. And of course, Christians will add another rabbi to this list. Jesus of Nazareth is of the house and lineage of King David. And that's important in Matthew and in Luke, that is explicitly tracked. Any thoughts, comments so far? I want to say just another thing about Jesus here, but before we get into that, any other shout out, because I can't see everybody. We good? Okay. Well, just real quick, that tracing of Jesus to David's line is important. Matthew starts out his gospel with an extended genealogy, and we've looked at this genealogy before: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the great patriarchs, all the way down through Ruth and Obed, and down to Jesse, the father of King David. Then there's another set of generations. You've got the kings. You've got David, Solomon, Rehoboam, all the way down, Uzziah, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Josiah. We've seen these folks. Jehoiakim, the guy that is released from house arrest eventually and goes to Babylon. And so then there's a third section that goes through Jehoiakim, Zerubbabel, who's important later, book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and then some others who are kind of not as important or well known, all the way down to an unknown guy named Joseph, husband of Mary. But what Matthew kind of traces in this genealogy, and genealogies kind of make us glaze over, but there's a real pattern here. Abraham's a nomadic shepherd, but eventually his descendants rise to monarchy. They become kings through King David. But then again, monarchs are not that swift, and we've seen that over and over again in the Deuteronomistic history. And so really, if you want to graph it, it really is kind of a monarchy has not been, you kind of reached the apex with David, but the monarchy has not worked out too great. In the end with Jehoiakim in exile. But then you go through another section of the narrative and things get restored to greatness. In fact, greater than David, Jesus comes from this lineage. And so that's an important part of the arc of all of this for Christians in Matthew's gospel. Yeah, Bob.
So I find I've always found it a little odd. I get what tracing Joseph back to Abraham, but then I still, maybe intellectually or spiritually, I've got to make the leap. Jesus really isn't kin to Joseph, but again, he's his earthly father, and he would be considered Joseph's descendant legally, I guess.
Yeah, and not just legal. That's a good question. Luke has a different genealogy, and it traces with some different ancestors. And one of the thoughts is maybe Luke is tracing Mary's ancestors. Luke is very Mary-centric. Matthew is very Joseph-centric in the birth narratives. But here's something that we miss. We talk about adoption. We talk about it being a legal means of being a father. But in the Middle East, in the Roman Empire of Jesus's time, there were no paternity tests. There were no guarantees of paternity. The way you guaranteed paternity is for dad to claim the son. It's no accident that at Jesus's baptism, the father claims his son. God speaks from heaven, "This is my son, the beloved." But Joseph in Matthew's gospel names Jesus. And so we say, oh, he gives him his name. But as far as they're concerned, that makes Joseph his 100% real father. Maybe not a biological father, but 100% real father in just about every way that we would think of fatherhood. And so adoption, we think of that as a legal thing, but we make the adoption and biological distinction. That was not important culturally at all. If the father claimed a son, then the son is the father's son. And that's the end of it. And so the fact that Joseph does name Jesus and that God asked him to do that ranks a little higher. But you're right. So by Joseph's blood, he's not of David's line. If Mary is of the house of David, he could get it matrilineally instead of patrilineal. But there's a disjuncture for us that was much stronger in their culture. So good question.
Dad. Also on that, I mean, Julius Caesar adopted Octavius and gave him the name Caesar too at that point, and they would, but later in life.
Yeah, Caesar Augustus called himself son of Julius, son of Caesar, though he was his nephew, but he was his adopted son, and so you are son, and that and even in fiction, Lew Wallace, when he does Ben-Hur, has the Roman general adopt Judah Ben-Hur. And that was big in that culture, that Roman culture. In fact, a lot of Romans, this is really odd to us, they would adopt adults, 20-something, 30-something men to be their adopted sons. You don't have to raise them, don't have to worry about teenage years. Just wait till they grow up, and then you can adopt them. And so that we would. Can you imagine being adopted at age 35 or something? We would never do that, but the Romans would do that on occasion. Just that it was a different cultural understanding than we have. Good, good. Well, back to Jerusalem here. So the capital is destroyed. The temple of God, temple of Yahweh is gone. And the big theological question is, how could this happen? How would God allow his temple to be destroyed? And the standard answer of their culture, all the neighbors would understand, well, that's a very easy answer. If your temple's destroyed, if your country is destroyed, if your capital is destroyed, if your king is killed, then your God is weak. Easy peasy. Your God's weak, your God's a minor God, maybe your God's not even a real God at all. But the fact that your country and your temple got taken out is prima facie incontrovertible evidence, as far as the culture is concerned, that your God is not really that strong, or is not even a God at all. So the standard answer would be, well, the Babylonian gods, Marduk is much stronger than Yahweh ever could be. Marduk, the Babylonian god, took out Yahweh, the little wimpy Israelite God. So Scripture has to push against that narrative and has to say, no, time out here. Our God's the real God. Why did this happen? And we've been leading up to a lot of this, and really in the Deuteronomistic history, all the way from Joshua to 2 Kings, also in the prophets, we've had some warnings that this is coming, and some groundwork being laid. And of course, the Deuteronomistic history is not quite edited into its final form yet either, and it will be during the time of the exile. So this is very much on the minds of the Jewish folks writing and compiling the books at this point. We've got to give an answer to this question. The Christians had a question too that they had to deal with a lot. How can you claim your guy is top dog if he gets killed by a Roman cross? Well, the Christian New Testament gives a lot of answers to why the crucifixion happens. It's not because he's defeated. The defeat is really a victory, but the same kind of thing happens here. So a lot of what we've been studying kind of leads up to this. And I said this even back in November, that the central overarching theme of the Deuteronomistic history and the Deuteronomic school is that we've got to be faithful to God. If so, we'll be blessed. And if not, we're going to be in trouble. And later on, we said back then, even in November, the reason we got wiped out as a nation and went to exile is not because God was weak, but because we were not faithful. And that's a very strong answer that suffuses this entire history and suffuses the prophets. God allowed this to happen because of us. It's not because it's God's fault or God's problem or God's weakness. It's because of our weakness, our issues. And we've talked about this before, but let's mention it again. There seemed to be a very strong attitude in Jerusalem before the Babylonians wiped them out, that since the temple was there and since the king was there, they were impervious. God would protect them. They could do anything they wanted to, and they would get away with it because the temple was there and the king was there, and God would protect both those things. And so the writings of Scripture really push back against this. I mean, even going back to Deuteronomy itself, it is conditional language. If you obey the commands of God that I'm commanding you, God will bless you in the land. But if your hearts turn away, if you're led astray, if you bow down to other gods and serve them, all those things that happen, you're not going to do well in the land that you're crossing into to possess. So even back in Deuteronomy, this is conditional language. It's an if then statement. If you do it, then it'll happen. But if you don't, it's not going to happen. And so don't just think you can do whatever you want. Same thing. Go ahead. Yes.
Even the book itself goes through a geopolitical argument as to why Jerusalem fell. And here, so how you reconcile the geopolitics is the answer that we tend to accept with this theological version, which we tend to reject just by the fact that we got the historical geopolitical argument.
Yeah, we tend to lean that way instead of the theological argument, don't we, John? And in a way, they do tie in together, because if you are impervious, if you are bulletproof, then your geopolitical choices might be a little foolish. We know teenagers that think that they are immortal and go out and do stupid things. Maybe there's some parallel there. They go out and make some stupid geopolitical choices because they think they can do anything they want. Carte blanche is a dangerous thing if you don't really have it, if you think you do. So that's a great point. It's a great point, John. You know, First Kings, Solomon, again, it's conditional language. If you keep my, God says, if you keep my statutes, then you'll be blessed. If not, you won't. Even in Josiah's time, towards the end of the reigns of all these monarchs, the end of the monarchy, God's already, said, well, it's kind of too late. We're going to have to, things are going to be wiped out. But because you've been faithful, I'll let you die first before all this other stuff happens. So it'll be after your death that things will fall apart. So we've got a lot of foreshadowing here in these scriptural texts. Yeah, Jimmy, go ahead.
I was just like, this may be completely off, but did God's glory also leave the temple at some point?
Ezekiel narrates that. Now Ezekiel narrating that as a prophecy.
Okay.
This Ezekiel's writing in between the first and the second conquering, in between 597 and 586. We'll talk more about him next week.
Okay.
But he very much, he prophesies not only the departure of God's glory from the temple, but he also prophesies the return of God's glory to the temple. But yes, I mean, in Solomon, you get this narration of God's glory coming in and setting up shop in the temple. But Ezekiel says it's going to depart, and he lays it out in pretty straightforward graphic terms. Okay. Other prophets too. I mean, even back to Isaiah, a couple hundred years. Jerusalem, you're not being faithful to God. You've become like a prostitute, like a whore. Your princes are rebelling. They're acting like thieves. They're not caring for orphans and widows. They are caring for themselves. This is not a good situation. Even back in Isaiah's time, the 800s, and we're in the 500s now. Isaiah later on, the end of that, the first Isaiah section, and probably comes more from the Isaiah school, but it's this clear prophecy. The days are coming. Talk to King Hezekiah. God says to Hezekiah through Isaiah, all your treasure is going to be carried up to Babylon. Nothing's going to be left. So God is not caught by surprise. The people may be caught by surprise. Maybe they shouldn't if they're listening to the prophets. But God is certainly foreshadowing this in Scripture. One of my, Micah, this is very blatant in Micah's time. The rulers are doing all these horrible things, abhorring justice, perverting equality, filling Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. And then they say, well, surely God is with us. And because of that, no harm will come to us. We can do what we want. We're doing all these bad things, but we can do what we want. And they say it point blank, God's with us. Nothing will happen. But Micah says, au contraire, Zion's going to be like a plowed field. Jerusalem's going to be a heap of ruins. And God's hill will be just like a wild mountainous place. And one of my very favorites, Jeremiah, and he's really kind of the closest in time here. He lays it out point blank. You still have a chance. Change your ways. Let me live with you, God says in this place. And then this wonderful line, do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Whenever Jews triple something, they mean it's very important. Isaiah, God is holy, holy, holy. The angels sing. That's super important. So don't deceive yourselves and say, because this is the temple, and it's God's temple, that God's going to protect you and let you do whatever. And Jeremiah also lays into them for their behavior. You're oppressing the alien, the orphan, the widow. You're shedding innocent blood. And then Jeremiah continues a few verses later in that chapter. You're letting this house become a den of robbers. Jesus uses that language later. And God says, let look what happened at Shiloh. The tabernacle was at Shiloh, the Ark of the Covenant. My presence was at Shiloh in that tabernacle. Where's Shiloh now? It's wiped off the map. See what I did to it for the wickedness of my people in the north. So if you think Jerusalem's safe because I'm there, Israel wasn't safe because I was up there in Shiloh with them. And the same thing's going to happen to you. I'll do to the house that's called to the temple just what I did at Shiloh. So we got lots of warnings in the Deuteronomistic history and in the prophets that this is not going to stand. You can't just be evil and expect God to protect you no matter what. And so we have this central overarching theme we've talked about before then. It's not because God's weak, it's because you're not faithful to God. And then really during the exile, the Jews added, therefore, go back to step one. We need to be faithful to God. That's the bottom line for the Jews, understanding what happened to them in the Babylonian exile and in the destruction of Jerusalem. Having said that,
Father Jim,
yeah, go ahead.
I can't remember, had the Ark of the Covenant been removed by the Assyrians already, or did it get taken by the Babylonians?
It was in the temple, and it got the Egyptian, it got down to Egypt somehow. I'd have to look that up, but it's during this time period that it gets removed.
Of course, the next question is how the heck did it get to Ethiopia, but that's besides the point.
Right. From Egypt to Ethiopia is a shorter jump there. Of course, Indiana Jones has it buried in Egypt. Jeremiah does end up in Egypt. There's a group that does go down to Egypt after Jerusalem's wiped off the map. No reason to stay here. This is an indefensible, awful place, and there's no temple here. No reason to stay. No king. We don't want to go to Babylon. Let's go the other direction, down to Egypt. And Egypt was not Babylonian. They were conquered by the Persians. They were conquered by the Assyrians earlier, but they were not conquered by the Babylonians. So independent at that point. But yeah, it's all gone at this point. So, ironically though, this is one of the worst possible things that could happen in Jewish history. It'll be repeated when the Romans destroy the Second Temple in the 70s. And the Holocaust is also a watershed, horrible moment in the history of the Jewish people. Those are probably the three worst things that have ever happened as far as Jewish history is concerned. The temple being wiped out twice, 586 BC, 70 AD, and then the Holocaust in the 21st century, or 20th century. But it was an enormous wake-up call. And unlike just about every other group that got wiped out and destroyed, the Jews survived. They survived to this day. They were able to cohere and be more serious about being a people in their exile, in their destruction of their city and capital. This is completely backwards from what happens in history. You take people off into exile, they should lose their identity. They should just melt away into the rest of the empire. That's what happened with the 10 northern tribes. They disappeared. And yet, Judaism really is born in this horrible crucible of the Babylonian exile. And what really happens here is they start getting serious. They do this graph. We were not faithful, therefore, let's get faithful, let's get serious. How will we do this? And how will we survive as a people? Well, let's pay attention to following the law. We haven't been doing a good job with that. Let's emphasize scripture. Let's teach it to our kids. Let's glom together as a people and have some coherence. Let's pay attention to the way we observe kosher dietary laws, and let's observe our festivals and worship and our Sabbath practices. And so these practices really bring cohesion to the Jewish people in spite of being in exile in Babylon. And the Old Testament, in the form we have it, a large bulk of it really gets shaped and finalized. There's still some more writings that will happen later that get brought into it. But a lot of the shaping happens at this point. And it's part of, we need to hold on to our identity. We need to hold on to our sacred writings. We need to preserve them. And we need to also be serious about what they taught us. We've kind of been lax for the past 700 years. Now it's time to get serious. It's a wake-up call that they really do take seriously. And the rampant idea, go ahead, Bob. Yeah.
So in the New Testament, the Pharisees are always getting on Jesus for not keeping the Sabbath, for not doing this, and so it makes more sense to say, well, look, this is what happens when we don't do what we're supposed to do. So darn it, do it.
Yeah.
Not do it. If any one doesn't do it, then that can endanger us all.
That's right. One bad apple will destroy the whole barrel. Yeah. So we all need to be followed. And the Pharisaic movement also was a reform movement that said, these rules in Torah were not just for the priests; they're for the Jewish people, and we all need to be doing it. And so that's important. And they really are trying to preserve, and not just trying to preserve. When the temple is destroyed a second time, it's the Pharisaic movement that does continue on and comes up with Mishnah and Talmud and all these wonderful cohesive writings and teachings of the rabbis. They do survive. They survive being in exile in Babylon. They survive being in weird ghettoization in medieval Christian Europe. They survive into the 20th and 21st century. These practices do bring them cohesion until such time as 1948, and they're able to come back into their country again. So it actually works. This really is a crucible that forms them as a people. And idolatry is not really a problem anymore. They will get lax at times and be called back into. You don't want to assimilate. You don't want to get too much like the other culture, because that's dangerous. But the rampant idolatry of setting up other gods and worshiping them really kind of fades off the radar screen at this point. There will be calls for reformation, calls for getting serious, back to the basics. We'll come to that again with Ezra and Nehemiah, but they really are serious from this point on, by and large, and especially in Babylon. And Babylon is going to be the center. We'll talk about this, more next time. For 1,500 years, Babylon is going to be one of the chief centers of Judaism. And it's astounding. And for 2,500 years, it'll be existing as a Jewish, a significant Jewish place. All right. Any other thoughts or questions? I want to say just a few minutes about the great prophet Jeremiah here. All right, Jeremiah is one of those prophets that has often gotten ignored. We, especially in the Christian church, our lectionary used to read a ton of Isaiah and very little Jeremiah. In fact, we looked a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Isaiah, a huge chunk, I should have brought that slide over, a huge chunk of the readings in our lectionary are from Isaiah. Part of the new lectionary we have is to correct that. And so we get a significant chunk of Jeremiah, not near as much as Isaiah still, but we do a lot more Jeremiah readings, especially in the third year. We're in the year B now, but in year C, we get Jeremiah in the fall as the Old Testament lesson. If we hadn't cut out the Old Testament lesson temporarily because of COVID last fall, we would have heard a lot of Jeremiah. So just a little bit about Jeremiah. We talked about it before. Jeremiah is one of the longest prophets. Factor out Daniel, because there was a prophet Daniel, but then there are later things attributed to him, and it's answering different questions. But Jeremiah is living from the time before King Josiah, living all the way down to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And remember, Josiah is a high point in Jewish history. Great reformations under Josiah, starting to really get rid of pagan worship during this time before he's killed by Pharaoh Necho in 609. But Jeremiah goes from these glory days all the way down to the horror of the destruction of Jerusalem, the two waves of exile in 597 and 586. Jeremiah is there to watch all this happening. Jeremiah is the longest prophetic book. He's longer than Isaiah. It's also the second longest book in the Bible after the book of Psalms. And so Jeremiah is a significant prophetic figure and significant writing. So longevity and volume of stuff. The book of Jeremiah talks about Jeremiah's scribe Baruch, and so Baruch is probably responsible for a lot of preservation of Jeremiah's stuff. In fact, at one point, Baruch's transcripts are all burned up, and they just recreate them and start again. So just this enormous volume of prophetic work from Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet for almost half a century, which is just this enormous career as far as prophets go. As we said, from the glory days of Josiah down to the horrors and the nadir of the exile. And a lot of his career is watching things fall apart, which is a negative pattern, a negative spiral. And he's got to be the one to comment on that. What a joy to be God's prophet as your country is falling apart because they're not faithful to God. That puts Jeremiah in a horrible, horrible spot. And yet he does act faithfully. He complains at times. He even at one point really lays into God and says, you've deceived me. You called me to be a prophet, then you're laying this on me. You've duped me, I've been duped. You've deceived me, I've been deceived by you. This is not good to be your prophet. But still he continues on being God's prophet in spite of complaining about it. In fact, Jeremiah's tone is so negative that we have an English word that's come from the name of Jeremiah. We say Jeremiah. It's kind of an obscure word these days, but if you make a long, mournful complaint or lamentation or just list all these horrible things, you're engaged in constructing a Jeremiad. So that's how bad he is, that we've got a word that comes from his tone, complaint and lament, and writing, Jeremiad. Jeremiah, because of all this, was horribly unpopular. Nobody wants to listen to Debbie Downer. Jeremiah even mentions that. I like the New Living Translation version. People make fun of him in the streets. He says, people are even calling me the man who lives in terror. You're kind of like Chicken Little. Jeremiah, sky's falling. Mr. Man who lives in terror. Aren't you just Debbie Downer? Well, he persists in it. And he's even imprisoned at times by the king. The kings are not always happy with Jeremiah making these proclamations about your kingdom's going to fall. That makes you popular with a popular figure with the kings. But of course, the sky does fall. So Chicken Little is not so wrong. The sky does fall in the end. So Mr. Terror on every side, or the man who lives in terror, turns out to be vindicated by the events of history. So I've said this in a sermon before. So Jeremiah was not a bullfrog. Jeremiah was not considered by anyone a good friend of mine. And in Jeremiah's time, no one understood or heeded a single word he said. So unlike the song, the prophet Jeremiah is just the complete opposite of that song. And he's not giving a message of joy to the world, all the boys and girls now. It's a pretty dark message. But Jeremiah is faithful in doing it all the way to the end. I mean, it's like being on a plane that's crashing into the ground, and yet Jeremiah is doing what God wants him to do all the way through that crash, all the way through our trajectory. So I want to just glance at a couple of texts here. Jeremiah is not always chronological. There's probably been some shuffling of pieces, parts, but we'll look at this more or less chronologically or numerically as far as chapters go. And look at the wonderful tone of Jeremiah. Thus says God, thus says Yahweh. What wrong did your ancestors find in me and God that they went so far from me and went after worthless things and became worthless themselves? Why are they chasing after false gods and other worthless things? I, God, brought you into plentiful land with fruits, but you entered and defiled it. You made my heritage an abomination. And even my priests didn't say, where is God in all this? And those who handle the law didn't even know me. And the rulers transgressed against me. And the prophets who should be prophesying by me prophesied by a pagan god, by Baal. And they all went after things that are not profitable, not worth anything. And then this lasting accusation here. Has anybody else done this? Can you name for me a nation that has changed its gods? Anybody change horses in midstream? How could you go away from me, God, and change other gods? No other nation does this, even though their gods are not really even gods. But my people have. They've changed their glory for something that does not profit. So be appalled, O heavens, be shocked, be utterly desolate. For my people have committed two evils. They've forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and they've dug out cisterns. They've dug out storage pits in the ground to store their water. And they're not even good cisterns. They're cracked cisterns that can't even hold water. Just a tough prophecy from Jeremiah there. This is what y'all are doing. You're forsaking the living God and going after worthless empty, vain things. We looked at chapter 7 a minute ago, talking about the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, and just don't rely on that. I destroyed Shiloh, and so you need to get back to me. I'm not going to protect you just because of my temple being in Jerusalem. One of the more famous ones, the kids actually learned this first. What's the kiddie song? Jeremiah, go down to the potter's house and see what God lays on your heart. That's not the lyric, but see what I say to you. And so Jeremiah goes to the potter's shop and talks at God's invitation. I skipped over those verses, but he's watching the potter work. The potter takes the clay, the potter shapes it, and yet the pot gets messed up. It's spoiled in the potter's hand. And so he mushes it down and starts again with the lump of clay and makes a different pot. And then God says to Jeremiah at the potter's house, can't I do the same thing to you, Israel, what this potter's doing? Just like the clay in the potter's hands, so you are in my hands. And so you need to be responsive. And if you're getting off and the shape is not going well, I'm going to smush you down and we're going to start again. And in a way, that's a good picture of what the exile is for the Jewish people eventually. They're getting smushed down so they can be reshaped into something different. And God says, I may say that one kingdom I'm going to support. Should have had an ellipses. There's verse 6. I may say I'm going to destroy a kingdom, but that nation may turn from its evil, and I'll avert the disaster. And then I may say that I'll build and plant another nation, but if it does evil, I'll smush it down, just like the potter does to the clay. And God says to the people, look, I'm the potter shaping evil against you. So turn now, all of you, from your evil ways, amend your doings, amend your ways. So that's probably the most famous prophecy of Jeremiah. But in spite of being Debbie Downer, in spite of being Chicken Little, there are some marvelous passages of hope in the prophet Jeremiah nonetheless. During the first exile, before the second exile, Jeremiah sends a letter to the people in Babylon. And he says, this is a message to the elders among the exiles, to the priests, the prophets, all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar took into exile in Babylon, the king of Babylon took into exile in Babylon. Thus says God to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile. So Nebuchadnezzar took you, but it's really me, God, that is putting you in exile because you're in the religious timeout box for 50 years or so because you have not been faithful. So while you're in Babylon, stick there for the long haul, build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat what your gardens produce, carry on with life, take wives, have sons and daughters, get your sons married off, give your daughters in marriage, that they may have sons and daughters. Multiply in Babylon, do not decrease. And also, while you're in exile, while I put you in exile, seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile. Care for Babylon, care for the place where you're planted at this point. And in your welfare, in its welfare, you'll find your welfare. I mentioned this a few weeks ago. St. Augustine talked about this in the city of God. That whatever city God has planted us in, we need to care for its welfare. It's not that we're completely separated from the context we live in. We need to care for the community around us. But it's long haul. It's not going to be short. I don't think you're getting out in 24 months or anything. You're going to be there a while. So dig into the long haul. But Jeremiah says in the same chapter, several verses later, but when Babylon's 70 years are completed, I will fulfill my promise. I'll bring you back to this place being Jerusalem, from where the letter is coming. For surely I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans for your welfare, not to harm, to give you a future with hope. And then when you call upon me and come and pray to me, I will hear you. When you search me, you'll find me if you seek me with all your heart. And I'll let you find me in these future days. I'll restore your fortunes. I'll gather you again from all the nations and all the places where I've driven you, and I'll bring you back. So we think of Isaiah, second Isaiah, being the great prophet of restoration, but Jeremiah also promises restoration. Ezekiel will too. We'll talk about him next week. And then one of the most warm-hearted, no pun intended, passages of Jeremiah from 31. The days are coming, I'll make a new covenant with you. You broke my former covenant. So we're going to make a new covenant. It'll not be like the old one, even though, because y'all broke it. But this is the covenant I'll make. I'm going to put my law within you. Instead of writing on tablets of stone, instead of it being external on parchment, I'm going to write it on your hearts. I'm going to be really your God, and you're going to be my God, my people intimately. And you'll no longer have to say, know the Lord, for all of you are going to know me, from the least to the greatest. And I'll forgive your iniquity and remember your sin no more. So Jeremiah is very negative. That reputation is well deserved, but he's not universally negative. There's some great prophecies of hope that are also in the book of Jeremiah. Any questions about Jeremiah here? Great prophet of this time. All right, that was a lot of stuff here. So next week, we'll look at the Jewish people in exile. We'll look more at that hope of restoration. We'll talk about the great prophet Ezekiel, who is the prophet of the exile. While Jeremiah is sitting in Jerusalem, writing to Babylon, Ezekiel's sitting there in Babylon and prophesying from there. And there'll also be prophecies of restoration. We'll get to those next time. Any final thoughts or comments here on the share screen? Cover it up there. Come on. Where's my share screen menu? Let's see here. Well, I'll just ask. Well, it disappeared. Oh, there he is. Okay, stop share. Good heavens, that disappeared. Frustrating when the technology doesn't work the way you want it to. All right, y'all. Final thoughts here. I can see your faces. Everybody's glazed over or overwhelmed or something. Okay. All right. Well, we'll pick up next time. We'll be in exile next time, and then we'll start talking about getting back out from exile. That's not going to be the easiest process, and it's not going to be an immediate process, but we'll say that for next time. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and stop. Good to see y'all, and we'll pick up in a week.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jim.
everybody.
Thank you.
You bet. Bye.